Thank you to those already joining us. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes before we get started to allow everyone to filter in.
I think that's actually good, because I think when they live.
Hi to everybody who has joined us. We're going to get started in just a minute. All right, so in the interest of everyone's time, I'm going to get started with the meeting. If anybody else is to enter later, is running late today, they can always feel free to introduce themselves upon their arrival, and I'll make space for that. However, I do want to get started. So with that, I just had a few housekeeping notes before we run through introductions. First, just as a reminder to all of our members, if you're going to engage in today's meeting, please just ensure that you unmute and speak. The chat, unfortunately, is not something we can utilize due to the fact that we are in a public meeting and the chat would not be publicly available on the recording. So please just unmute and speak if you are going to engage. That being said, if you are not actively speaking, given that a lot of us are back in the office, please just mute when you are not actively speaking, just to reduce any confusion as well as eliminate any potential background noise. For folks that might be watching this recording later, I just want to remind everyone that we do have an attendance policy that's written into the legislation for our council. So I just encourage folks to review that, and should you have been unavailable for both today and our last meeting, just speak with me. I want to ensure that folks can continue to engage on the council and continue to engage the seats that are allotted in the legislation. And for both folks who are here today, as well as those who are watching the live stream or the recording in the future, the documents that are being discussed in today's meeting, as well as were brought up in our last meeting, are publicly available on the council's page on the CGA website. So should you have any questions about those particular documents, you can refer to them there and reach out to any members of our council regarding specific questions about those documents. If you're unsure of where to go, you can always start by reaching out to me and I can send you to the right person. So all of that being said, thank you very much for being here today, whether it be your presence at this meeting as a council member, your presence as a matter of, as a member of the public or one of our higher institution spaces watching this recording. But we are glad to be here and to be discussing our further steps for our council. So with that, I will just send it for a round of introductions, starting with my own, and then I'll just introduce folks by their first name, and then if they can then share who they're representing or in what capacity they are here on our council. So with that, my name is Bridget Kessner. I am a policy manager with the Connecticut Alliance to End Sexual Violence and appointed under one of our slots at the coalition here. Just going based on my screen, next would be Lily.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lily Svensson. I'm the director of Yale's Office of Institutional Research, and the chair that I'm holding is that of someone with expertise in the development, design, and implementation of campus climate assessments, including ones about sexual misconduct.
Thank you very much, Lily. Next is Cameron.
Hi there, Cameron List. I'm the Title IX coordinator at the University of Connecticut, representing the University of Connecticut.
Thank you. Next is Nisha.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Neisha Gonzalez. I am with Safe Haven of Greater Waterbury, and I'm the bilingual bicultural advocate here.
Thank you. Next is Hillary.
I'm Hillary Haldane. I'm a professor of anthropology at Quinnipiac University, and I have one of the research seats on the council.
Thank you very much. Next is Kara.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kara Mackler, Director of Community Impact at the Center for Empowerment and Education. We're a member center of the Alliance to End Sexual Violence, and I also work at our satellite office at Western Connecticut State University.
Thanks, Kara. Next is Lisa.
Hi, I'm an attorney with the Victim Rights Center of Connecticut, and we're a division of the Connecticut Alliance to End Sexual Violence.
Thank you, Lisa. And then lastly is Jazaira.
Good afternoon. My name is Jazaira. I'm the committee clerk, and I'm pretty much helping with the administrative aspect of the council. So of course you'll be getting Zooms and agendas from me and Bridget for future meetings. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And thank you again for your help in that administrative piece. So our agenda, I had both sent out to the council members, but for those of you following along is available on today's CGA schedule. So following introductions, we will be discussing the deliverables today. So at our last meeting, we had talked about members of the council resuming kind of review of the content that we have put together thus far and seeing what needs to be done in order for those deliverables to be complete and distributed. So once we discuss what is done at this point in time and what needs to be completed, we'll discuss what the timeline would look like for that process and any next steps. I want to open the floor for any miscellaneous questions or discussion and then we will adjourn. So I'm hopeful that we'll have a fruitful conversation today and that folks had a chance to really review the materials in order to get a grasp of what we will need to do next. I know I had a chance to review them before this meeting, but also before our last one. So I feel a sense of familiarity, but I'm definitely eager to see what the experts in this space have to share about what they believe we'll need to complete before we move ahead with distribution. So that being said, I want to open the conversation about that discussion, beginning with first the discussion of the recommended survey tools and the data points, and what folks were able to essentially figure out upon their review of that material. So I'll open the floor if anybody would be interested in starting to discuss. Lily?
Thank you again, Bridget, for sending around the not just the links to those materials, but also in your note to the council, sort of denoting which piece of that folder would be most helpful for which part of the discussion. I found that a really helpful refresher, and a really nice guide kind of back through this council's work. I think as kind of an overarching thought about our approach as a council at this point, what came to mind for me was the importance of bringing clarity and some simplification, if we can, to colleges and universities in the state. Back when we were drafting the materials that you helped send back around, we were in a different landscape, right? We didn't have the newer VAWA regs that are now in place. And with those in place and this sort of incoming federal survey that's still some ways off, but will be quite detailed and I think prescriptive. Kind of with that in mind, I had a very different perspective kind of looking back through the materials as we had drafted them, because we were drafting them without those regs in place or looming. So I would be really curious to hear sort of what other folks, especially who might work on campuses, are thinking at this point about kind of how to reconcile some of these different mandates that we have.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a great place to start. And I'm definitely eager to see what folks from institutions have to say, if anybody wanted to jump in response to that.
Yeah, I would certainly echo that I think that the most important thing, being on an institution, and what's going to be coming out of this is just the flexibility to do it, especially with the shortened timeline that we're running up against now. A lot of the vendors that we're interacting with are giving us kind of December timelines. So I think that we need the guidelines to be flexible enough to accommodate that while accomplishing, everything that's in the statute. But we're looking forward from UConn's perspective to having it clarified. And I think that there's a lot that we can do here with what's already there, but I do think the simplification would be a very nice touch for, on the ground implementation. How are we going to get through this over the next few months?
Thank you for that. Any additional thoughts in response to Lily's point? All right. Well, I do think that that's a helpful lens to move forward with. Again, as Cameron mentioned, given our timeline, given the deadlines that institutions are coming up against. So I definitely want to move forward with that. With that lens in mind and the content that we presently have, what do the folks here feel like would need to get done? Like, how can we take that information and create something that would be helpful in providing some clarity and simplification for institutions, as you had discussed? Yeah, Hillary?
Just wondering in terms of what role we as a council play as far as offering like consultation for this process. So for instance, I was looking over, I think that the surveys that we've looked at that we have in the shared documents, they all cover the areas that are required by the state law, the ones that we've highlighted. So any of those could be used by any of our institutions. Many of them are free and accessible So as far as, are there instruments that are already available that we've looked over that we know will do the job that we need for the state requirements? Absolutely. I think that even as far as the implementation, I think there's enough guidance in there right now. I mean, I think it just needs to be pulled into like a one-page kind of document that just gives that guidance to the universities. But are we able, I mean, are we able to serve as kind of like, you know, a consultative role in terms of just explaining to the institutions what we're looking for? Because I think that what might be confusing is they get this information, you know, we send a letter or whatever it might be with some of the, you know, example surveys that they could use, some of the example instruments. But are they able to like ask us questions? Because I could see them saying like, wait, what is it that we're supposed to do and by when? Especially given that we had that original list of contact people at the universities, and in the year and a half since, you know, those people have changed. So Bridget, like, what are we even able to do as far as be available to answer the questions, given that the universities have to do this by March? And that if they're even aware, you know, again, the change of positions, if people are even aware that there's this other survey, that they can't use this forever because another survey is going to be forthcoming, even though that RFP from the BJS just closed in August. So we're not going to see that, as Lily said, for a while. So I'm just wondering what kind of role we serve in that capacity.
Sure. And I think that's a great question. And I know that sort of consultation technical assistance piece is something we've discussed in the past, and I think is perhaps even more relevant now, just given the conflict with this future federal mandate and a sense of confusion around that future federal mandate because of, you know, some federal lack of clarity. So I do think that it would be helpful for institutions to, at the very least, have a contact sheet with some kind of just brief preface stating that here are some individuals on this council, right, that, and kind of listing out what seats that we hold and how to get in touch with us should they have any questions. Of course, I'm always happy to be an initial point of contact to point folks in the right direction. Should they be unsure exactly who would be the best person to, you know, have that consultation with. So should folks here feel comfortable with that sort of structure, having, again, a contact sheet, a preface that we're happy to help, and then having a point of contact for people that may not know where to start. We can definitely move forward with that being perhaps attached to the implementation guidance. And I think it would be helpful. I also think just to provide overarching kind of clarity, again, is something we had discussed in the past. It would be helpful to have an introduction to all of this material that just includes information about the council's process up to this point, and information about how this may in the future, how this looks different as a result of the federal guidance, as well as how it may look different moving forward. So I'm definitely happy to draft both those pieces. And then if folks want to look those over, that could be a way we can move forward, unless somebody feels confident that it's something they would like to take on, in which case I'm happy to share or delegate that piece. And then just one last point related to the contact sheet, as you had mentioned. That is within the materials as well. And perhaps I noticed I had checked it yesterday just to see if any further updates had been made. And I didn't see any updates, but if we want to check that over and ensure that all the information is up to date, we do have an Excel sheet. So if any of you representing institutions want to just make sure all the information is up to date, and then those of us who represent perhaps you know, have a broader reach in terms of the regions that we represent, we can also review and ensure that the information is up to date as far as we know. But I think that's something I do want to complete in the coming you know, month or few weeks, depending on the timeline we sort of decide. But it's one of the critical next steps. But Lily, I see your hand up, so feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on an idea that's come up a couple of times so far, and that it sounded like maybe this is where you were also aiming, Bridget, but this idea of sort of what would kind of a brief update letter out to campuses look like? And Hillary, to your point about like how so many of the kind of big pieces of this have already come through the committee's work. There's like almost a short form versus long form guidance model that seems like it might be emerging here, where maybe toward the end of September or that kind of early October timeline. Bridget, and I'm looking at your timeline that you sent around to the council, where there is already kind of a milestone designed in, sort of in a couple weeks from now, sending out kind of a first communication or making that available more broadly. And if there's an opportunity to kind of write a little bit of a cover letter to that gives not just an update, but also maybe says, here are a couple of issues that we know as a council might be on campuses' minds for planning purposes, we could kind of head those off potentially. I'm thinking of the kind of issues around like timing or design, or like where would I go to look for this kind of information, that I think would probably come up for an institution. I'm happy to take a stab at some of that language if that would be helpful, to try to write some of that down and send it your way, Bridget.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm definitely happy for that contribution. And I think that it would be helpful to have that initial contact, as we had, discussed, from the council. I think also based on both my review and our discussion today, it really seems that the contents of what we will be disseminating to these institutions is in a very while it's a rough draft, the content is there. So it's really just a matter of formatting at this point, which could potentially move our timeline up, should that be something that folks feel comfortable taking on. Again, recognizing that will really just look like, drafting a completed product. So based on this discussion, I think if we want to send something out in the next 2 weeks, the next week would really be ensuring that we have the correct contacts from each institution on that spreadsheet that, I had sent out to the council, but again, is available on the council's landing page on the CGA site for those of you who are following along. So ensuring that those contacts are up to date, disseminating out just a quick introduction. But I think at this point, depending on the timeline that you would all like to set for drafting, that final kind of report from our council, with, again, the tools that would be listed, the data points that they would need to complete under the legislation, as well as the implementation guidance, which all would be, preceded by a sort of another introductional kind of page to orient everyone, as well as that contact list of council members for further guidance. If that is a product that we feel we can complete in, say, the 2 weeks that would follow, let me know, but I'm open to what timeline works for everyone, given your own schedules and workload and everything of that nature, and recognizing that this is something I do want multiple people within this council to have their hands on. So I'd be interested to hear any feedback about your thoughts on the timeline. I think the 2 weeks is totally suitable for a review of the contact list and a distribution of an introductory email. But I'd be interested to hear about your thoughts on timeline for the final draft. Hillary?
Yeah, I think 2 weeks is great. And I was just looking at our shared document in terms of, it seems like we've got 8 institutions where we don't have any contact person. And I was just going to volunteer that I'm happy to call those 8 institutions. If any, I mean, if people want to look that over, if you already know who the people are, there's eight institutions that we don't have a name for. But if no one knows who fills that slot, I'm happy to call just to find out who our contact person would be. I'm happy to take that on. The other thing would be, Bridget, I think it's going to be really important that we clarify in this letter also what the reporting requirements are. So for instance, one of the things that's never been clear to me is what do the institutions have to return as far as information back to the council? So are those data being collected? I mean, not just by the institution, they're collecting those data, but then what's our role in terms of, are they supposed to then report to the state those data? So that's what I'm just wondering if we need to clarify that, because it would seem to me that what's the point of this exercise if we're not gathering those data to inform us about what's happening in the state? I mean, I don't know what the clarification is around that. But the other thing that would be very helpful, I think, just this few years that we have kind of in limbo, not knowing what's coming down from the federal government, is can we ask the institutions even to inform us what instrument they did eventually use? I mean, so what are we allowed to ask? And then what are we collecting as far as that guidance as well?
Yeah, and I think that's an important piece. And I think will be a conversation I'd be interested to have in the council in regards to how we would like to sort of do our own follow-up to the information that's gathered. I know that information does need to be made publicly available, but I can, connect with Jazeera just from her standpoint and, in her administrative role, to see about any directions we can provide about how to ensure that that information is being reported correctly, to the state. And then from there, I think we would, of course, include the language in the legislation that requires it to be made publicly available, just so institutions ensure they know what's kind of in the legislation. I think just the legislation itself is going to be a component that we should be including in, in our content, our final packet. Lily?
Yeah, I wanted to say I appreciate Hillary, you bringing up that like there's this sort of life cycle of this project, and if we can kind of clarify up front a little bit of the what's currently maybe a little vague in the guiding legislation about like exactly how do we interpret this word, it's, I think, comes back to a point you made, Hillary, earlier as well, about sort of what is the role of this committee? Is this the place where a school would go to get a yes or a no about whether their plan will keep them in compliance? Or is there something we can do up front to give some clarity around the existing legislation that will allow schools not to maybe need that check-in as much, because they would kind of have more information to go off of, to feel really confident that they're gathering information in a way that will serve their students as well as possible, while also staying in compliance with this regulation.
Yeah, and I think to some extent, I think we can provide some of that clarity in our initial cover letter, and in the way that we preface the information that we provide. Again, the prescribing legislation does provide a very reasonable amount of flexibility for institutions to choose the tool that is the best fit, to implement the assessment in the way that best fits their institution. And I think that providing a preface about that flexibility, you know, is going to be important. But if, you know, but also being clear about the existing requirements and where those are firm. So I think we can definitely preface each piece with some of that clarity. And then of course be available for future clarity. But if there's something beyond that that we would want to complete, you know, I can definitely try to figure out what that would look like with the help of some council members. So all
Yeah,
of that,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. No, jump in.
I was just going to say, because the point is there's flexibility, but there are the requirements. And so who's verifying that what instrument they used kind of meets that bar? I guess that's the part where that it's vague. But who's overseeing that? I guess that's the part that is still not clear to me. Who's ensuring that those data points are being collected? And I just kind of feel like that's a part of this that is too vague for my comfort. And so I'm just wondering, as a council, was that supposed to be our role? And so I think that guidance is going to be really important, because the university can say, oh yeah, no, we're going to be asking those questions. And then there's so many ways that, you know, when you say that you have to make it publicly available, we're not saying like, show us the exact question that was asked and then the response rate and then, you know, what was found at your institution. So how are we checking off? The way that we oversaw, like the way that we reviewed those instruments was to line up what those questions were that are available in the instrument and then what was in the legislation. And so that's why we came up with the instruments that we would recommend, because we know that they meet that bar. But is it just a trust? We're just trusting that institutions are doing this? I mean, that's where I'm still unclear.
Right.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
And yeah, go ahead, Lily.
Yeah, I was gonna suggest this maybe as a topic for one of this council's meetings, where later this fall, or even, I don't know if we'll still be meeting after January or if January is just the deadline for some of our deliverables. But this might be a topic that we are able to kind of save as a topic of discussion and workflow and kind of a design question for a little bit later, as long as institutions have more clarity about sort of what they're generally expected to do by when. There is a line in the legislation that like their results have to be posted with a web link. And so maybe there's some kind of that short form guidance can help them look ahead to, like, the council is going to continue deliberating and follow up with some guidance about, you know, exactly how these results will be reviewed and like what's going to come out of that. But I guess I'm wondering like how much of that question we need to answer up front before campuses kind of get rolling with their data collection.
Sure. Any thoughts?
Well, the only thing on that would be to make sure that whatever instrument they pick, they're going to meet those data points. That's the part for me that is the, you know, and there's not that, we're not really asking. I mean, it's a pretty slim ask, you know, if you really look at it, but just to ensure that there's the flexibility, but you do have to ask these. And I think to Lily's point, you know, the concern would be for them to, you know, we don't want them to miss that as they move forward with this. This isn't something that they can fix after they've already done the survey. It should be in front of them. Whatever instrument they pick, they need to know whatever else is in this survey, these components are required by law. So I feel like that part of the legislation needs to really be highlighted so that they're aware of that, and that will be reported. And in some ways, it's that guidance about, we need to make it clear that what you're reporting are numbers that meet that requirement, if that makes sense. Like whatever those survey data are, they need to have met those questions, however you've put those questions out there. So I do feel like it is a part of that front end, so that they're building from that, as opposed to thinking about how they post it for public consumption, which is going to be managed by their marketing divisions anyway, on the back end of it.
Yeah, I can definitely appreciate that. I think in terms of long-term support, I'm definitely happy to sort of figure out as a council how we want to move forward with potential future meetings and future contact with one another to ensure that we're providing ongoing support and ongoing communication. And also, I think there are ways we can provide clarity about what is absolutely necessary for institutions within the draft that we'll be completing. In recognizing that it, would make sense to include both the prescribing legislation as well as perhaps, a short document explaining how they need to go about the publication of that information and what they need to, ultimately publish. I think would be, two components of that, which again, I can work with Jazeera and ensure that we have all the correct kind of legislative pieces there. But are there any other thoughts about this particular piece and compliance? Okay. So not seeing anything further, I think what needs to be completed, again, we talked about that 2-week plan and completing our contact sheet and putting out that initial contact. And Lily and I can sort of spearhead that, the language for that, that outreach. If everybody can give that document a review sometime in the coming week, that way we can ensure that we have accurate information. Hillary, since you offered, if you don't see those, the institutions that don't have that information completed, you can definitely jump in and do so there. And then from that point, I do want to move forward with putting together our final draft, having generally, again, based on my own review and based on the feedback that has been provided here, it sounds like we have everything we need. We just need to put it into a document that will make sense and be easily consumed by these institutions. And then the pieces that would just need to be drafted as small pieces would be, the cover letter, a contact list for our council, the prescribing legislation, which is a completed document, but just something we would want to attach, as well as information about the reporting component. So I think, again, I distributed that timeline, but given the level of urgency I'm feeling from institutions and wanting this information completed, and in understanding where we're at, being, further ahead, then perhaps we had thought ahead of the review of these documents. What would people feel comfortable with being the timeline? Is this something perhaps we can complete in the next 6 weeks or so and have distributed by the end of October, beginning of November? Or is that, would that be too soon? I want to, again, just be conscious of everyone's workloads otherwise, and in recognizing, that we will need support from the council in order to create these final drafts. Lily?
To that question, what do you see as our meeting cadence over that time period?
Sure. So I think I of course, I don't think it'll be necessary to meet after we send out that kind of introductory piece. I think if we wanted to meet one time before the distribution, just to ensure that we've checked everything off of our list and we are in compliance with what we need to complete, I'd be glad to do that. I imagine it would be a shorter meeting, given that we don't actually need to discuss, but just ensure that everything, is completed and good to go. then that would be fine with me. If folks don't feel that that's necessary, feel free to let me know, but I do think it would be helpful just to connect and ensure that everything we need is together, ready to be distributed. And at that point, I think we can also discuss what we want our council's role to be moving forward once the information is distributed. So do we want to set a meeting for, a couple or a few months in the future to discuss what this is actually looking like on campuses? Do we want to touch base about the questions that we've been getting or other types of support we'd like to provide? But I think it could be an opportunity to discuss what our next steps would look like past the deliverables that we'll be completing at that point. So that being said, I think our next meeting will depend upon the timeline that we decide upon for when we complete that final draft. If we did decide to complete it by November 1st, I would say, sometime leading, sometime perhaps in that week, leading up to that final date. Again, just as a matter of wrapping up our work and ensuring we have everything completed, but I, again, am open to any feedback. Cameron.
Yeah, just a couple things. So kind of going back to that preliminary information that you're looking to share, I think that it would be really valuable to the institutions if we could include kind of breaking out those three main categories of information that must be covered in the survey. And then also highlighting, in the statute where it says it needs to be distributed to all students. I think that both of those are really important as institutions are interacting with vendors and potentially going through that bidding process so that they can at least understand kind of the baseline requirements that we're looking at here. And then secondly, related to what we were just talking about, it would be really great, I think, to have maybe a document template where we can start plugging in the information if we are kind of taking it from these various, formats and documents that are on, the shared information and putting it into one, just to see kind of how you're visualizing that and how you would like to see it shared out. Because I'm happy to jump in and start moving information over. I just don't, particularly know what we want that end product to look like.
Absolutely. And I mean, I can put that together, but also if somebody would like to volunteer, I'm happy to pass that task along. But I think I agree that it would be most helpful to move forward by having a single kind of template rather than just trying to gather all of these independent documents. And then the clarity around what would be helpful for that initial contact, I also really appreciate. But any thoughts about sort of our final template for that information?
And just to clarify, this is how institutions would report in 6 months after running a study on what they had found. Is that the template you're just?
I was talking more like a template for what our final product is going to look like. So the product that goes out at the end of October, what is that document going to look like from us as a council to the schools?
Yeah, so I think that final document that would line like where we would have the different tools lined up, the different data points, as well as any implementation guidance, and then the cover letter and such as we discussed today. All right, so I can plan to be the one to establish that template in the next 2 weeks. But again, should somebody prefer to take that task on, let me know and I'm happy to delegate. Unless I hear otherwise, we've been operating in Google Docs and that seemed to be a good way for this particular group to get organized. But if that's problematic for any reason, please let me know and I can, figure out how to accommodate that. Kara.
I just had a quick question. Can we confirm which tools we are recommending? Because looking at the kind of Excel sheet where we're tracking the data points, there are some that are listed as for those kind of 3 main points as like partially meeting that requirement or not meeting that requirement. So I just want to confirm which tools we are moving forward with if we've made that decision or if we're making that today.
Sure, I appreciate that. Does anybody want to jump in based on their review of that information? Someone who had perhaps worked on that. Yeah, Lily.
Yeah, I think my suggestion would be, at least for the purpose of a short form sort of document, to rely on the instruments that, like, if we're saying, if you're going to do a whole instrument, here are the ones that we know include all the questions you need, so you can kind of plug and play on those. But other instruments are out there that would also collect information on these factors, and that's acknowledged in the statute as well. So you want to kind of keep that in mind, Cameron, to your point about institutional flexibility. So maybe what we could do is to say, sort of in that cover sheet type of document, here are a couple of entire instruments that we know and would cover these points, and like on the back page, or in a separate document, we've actually pulled out the instruments that we're thinking, or the questions that we thought of as a council that like we saw as fulfilling this need, so that it's like even clearer. Because we also did that documentation work in our Google Doc. I kind of did that legwork, so we could even go a step further and just like copy and paste those questions, because these are, at least the AAU survey and the ARC3 are in the public domain, which is really important. And some of the legwork that this council did, which was really thorough, was to go through even instruments that are not in the public domain, but that individual institutions might be able to access through other means, like through the membership in a consortium, and to test drive whether those instruments would suffice. So like we've done that, but thinking back to this idea of how do we make things simpler? How do we bring some clarity? Maybe we could focus on sort of, if you're looking for an idea of language, here is some language that is out there. It's in the public domain, but acknowledging that these are not the questions you have to ask. I don't know, would that kind of help, so that we're not sort of listing survey instruments that like might get you part of the way there, but then there are some gaps that you might need to fill in. I think maybe we could come up with a phrase or a little bit of language in that kind of cover letter that points to like mileage may vary for other instruments.
Yeah, I think that clarity would be helpful, and to really, highlight the surveys that perhaps would best align with the data points, but recognizing that there are a lot of other reasons that institutions may choose other tools. I think we can definitely highlight that. And I think something I do want to make clear to institutions is, as you had sort of just said, that in a lot of ways our council recommendations are just that, right? They're recommendations, and that institutions have a good amount of flexibility here to kind of identify what works best for them. So I think we can sort of continue to provide that clarity as to, again, what best aligns with perhaps meeting those data points, if that's the institution's greatest need is finding a tool that fits that. But again, acknowledge that there may be other tools that are a better fit, and then they're going to need to supplement those data points. Kara.
Thank you. Yeah, the only other question I had on that, and sorry if this is like late in the game to bring this up. But just coming from my like advocate lens, I was reviewing the survey tools that we have, and I did notice some discrepancies in how, like in particular, rape was defined, even just in, oral penetration versus vaginal and anal penetration. And I do think that's really important that there's consistency if we're going to be providing these tools, this recommendations, that there is like consistency across the definitions, but also even in language, if there's any way we can recommend. I saw in one of the tools, they use terms like accuser or accused, and maybe we should make some recommendation around, complainant or respondent, so it's consistent with Title IX language. So there were just little kind of jargony things that I noticed that I don't know if that's something, I don't know how customizable these are, and that like we can make those recommendations without putting extra work on the institutions, or if that's something that we can have, I don't know, ahead of time of these are the suggestions we have for consistent language across the state for all the institutions to utilize.
Yeah, Lily.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Kara, about like what is the intersection between institutions, data collection, and like basically the language a student would see on a survey that they're taking, what the institution then thinks about and how they might kind of then analyze those results, and then how this council thinks about looking across the various findings that institutions end up sharing back. I think one piece of guidance that would come to mind for me, kind of from a survey design perspective, is that we can think about those areas of language almost as having kind of distinct patterns compared to each other. So the language that our students use and that they would understand and recognize, and that would help them take a survey, would probably be different language than administratively we would use to understand patterns that we see around campus, which would probably in turn be slightly different nuanced language or definitions than we might expect to have kind of in a conversation across campuses. Because each campus, I think, has a need to understand students' like knowledge and awareness of that institution's policies and practices. So that alone is going to bring some heterogeneity into like what definitions we would see deployed in data collection from one institution to another. It's kind of gets back, I think, also to a point that Hillary made earlier about like ultimately what will this council need to receive from institutions. And one thing that I think it might be a good idea to kind of plan for in that guidance for, what would we need to receive in the spring, summer, fall sort of timeframe, would be information on the methods used and the definitions that were used, so that we don't just have a data point or a finding, we also have the language that the institution used to gather that, because that's going to be different for various reasons from one institution to another. And it's important for interpreting the information that an institution is offering.
Yeah, thank you very much for offering that, Lily. I think definitely including some piece about that in our implementation guidance and the importance of sort of defining these points and including those definitions in with any of the reporting that institutions do. I also would be curious, and if anybody has done this in particular, please feel free to jump in and share kind of your takeaways. But I would also be curious as to if any of those which terms might be included in the data points that must be collected. If any of those terms are sort of, where there is kind of a greater variance in their meaning. Because I think that might be something we would want to be responsive to before sending out a final draft. I think there's going to be a certain level of variance in language just naturally because we have all of these institutions that are going to be choosing different assessments. But ultimately, I think the data points that are built into the legislation were done so that there is some kind of points that every institution is gathering. And if we identify that there might be a problem with consistency with those points, that's definitely something I would like to discuss so we could perhaps remedy that before sending out a final draft. So as folks are reviewing that piece, as we work to complete that final draft, please keep that in mind, and we can open up a conversation about what we might want to recommend, based on that language. And it's never too late to have any of these conversations. To sort of speak to your preface, Kara, I'm glad you brought it up. So just for final clarification on my end, does again, in recognizing that we'll have that first contact out to the campuses in the next 2 weeks, providing further clarity on our timeline, as well as just a few other points. After that point, does a month sound like a reasonable time frame to, provided a template with kind of that initial introductory letter and everything? Does a month sound like a reasonable time frame to fill in that template for those of you here? Yes. Okay. Just to ensure that everything does get done, perhaps if you just want to, in the next couple of weeks, consider which parts you were especially involved in and kind of what role you'd like to have in terms of that final draft. I just want to ensure that across the board, we have different members of the council contributing to different components of that draft, so that it doesn't just fall into the hands of one or two of us. I want to ensure that it is, a group effort. The other piece is, as we are discussing contact lists anyway, in regards to the institutions, I'll put together just a sheet for all of you to complete, just your institutional affiliation, if any, and then the contact information that you would like to put down for yourself for, kind of this contact sheet that'll go out to campuses. Well, of course, I have each of your individual emails. I want to ensure that you can, put down a phone number or something like that, ensure that you're getting that information to the right point. So I'll put together that contact list, as well as, again, we'll all review those contact lists. Lisa, I see your hand up.
So my question is, for this introductory letter, are you going to list every member of the council with contact information, which concerns me just because to have somebody that I don't know calling me, asking me what the council thinks or what the council was, I certainly don't want to speak on behalf of everybody. I'm also a lawyer. I don't want to be giving legal advice that wouldn't be everybody else's advice. So I'm wondering if there should be like maybe just signed by the chair. Not that I'm trying to keep myself, you could certainly list our names and everything, but I do have a concern about speaking to a member of the public about what we thought or what we were planning or intended without bringing it to the full council.
Sure. And I can appreciate that. I think if there are members of the council that I think the introductory letter I was imagining I would likely just sign on to, unless folks felt differently, but I don't want to speak, for everyone necessarily. And it's really just to provide a preface to what is to follow throughout that packet, and a bit of background on the council and the prescribing legislation. So I was planning on just authoring that. But I think the contact list would probably go further down in more so connected with the implementation guidance. If anybody has any follow-up questions about any of those pieces. I think it may also just be helpful. We'll have kind of the designations identified, in that, so people know exactly why this person is on the council and what seat they hold. If we wanted to extend that to speak to kind of say like what you can contact particular people with, that's fine. And again, we can kind of put at the top that, I'm happy to volunteer just to be a kind of initial point of contact to direct people to the right person to answer their questions. It would be hard to imagine people getting kind of random questions from members of the public just as being a part of that contact list, but of course I can't promise that. So if anybody has particular questions about their name and email being on that list as a point of contact for the council, we can definitely discuss that one-on-one and figure out to what extent you're kind of comfortable being included in that packet. But it would really just be so that, folks could reach out based on your, again, designation to the council, based on your role, based on what you can contribute, follow up with any questions to you specifically, or, connect with you. But yeah, Kara, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to suggest that maybe it would be helpful once we have completed the template with everything that we're going to be sending out to the institutions to have an internal kind of FAQ for our council, so that if we are asked, some questions by our institutions that are kind of connected to us, that we have kind of ready to go answers or blurbs or kind of responses that are consistent across the entire council, so that if I'm asked, from WCSU a question, and then Lisa's asked a question from another institution, we have similar answers. And obviously, there are going to be maybe questions that we wouldn't be able to have prepared ahead of time, but if we have kind of a preemptive, okay, these are probably some of the questions we're going to field, let's come up with some, generic responses that we can, and then come together as a council if we need to connect about something more in depth.
Sure, absolutely. I think that's a great idea. And given that we're ahead of the timeline we had initially thought, I think that can be a great way for some of us to spend some time following that distribution of the final draft. So yeah, I think we can definitely talk further about some sort of like internal FAQ. And I also want to assure folks that, I you can definitely, after being asked a question, speak to me, speak to other council members, and delegate that question out to someone else if you think it would be more appropriate for them to answer. I don't want anybody to be in a position where they absolutely have to respond to something that they don't feel that they were a substantial part of, or is not their expertise. So just know that I don't have the expectation, and I don't imagine, anyone here would, that any particular person would need to speak to every aspect of this council's work. I don't think even as the chair, I would necessarily want to do that. I'd want to delegate to different experts within this council. So I definitely want to relieve that pressure as well. So not hearing any objection, I think our best move would be to attempt to complete a final draft between 2 weeks from now, which would be September 26th. And then have that ready, which actually would also fall on a Tuesday, ready by the 31st of October. So unless there are any objections to that timeline, I do think I don't see any reason why we can't move forward with that final draft in that time frame. I can have a template by 2 weeks from now, likely earlier, but I imagine that that's when we'll all be working on it. So just take some time to familiarize yourself with the content that already exists had you not had the opportunity in the last month, and just prepare for that final drafting. Again, if we'd like to kind of talk more about who would like to complete each piece, let me know. But at this point, I think everybody is sort of self-designated their specialties and the elements of the work that they've done here, and can work on that accordingly. Of course, we all have each other's contact information, so feel free to keep in touch with one another as we work toward that final draft. But I will send that template out to everyone, and then we'll have a chance to complete that. And before that time, in the next 2 weeks, Lillian and I will connect about that information that will go out to all the institutions. But I just ask that you please review the contact sheet and ensure that the institutions that are, within your umbrella are up to date, as well as fill in the contact sheet for a council. But again, feel free to contact me if you have any concerns about how you're listed there. So I think we do have a map in regards to what our timeline looks like. I do like to ensure we set a next meeting while we are sharing this space, because Tuesday afternoons have been identified as the time where the most council members are free. I would be comfortable meeting on October 24th. Again at 12 p.m. if that works for folks, unless there's some major thing I'm missing. But that would give us a week before distribution in order to just address any last minute issues, questions. And at that point, I would be hopeful that we could have a final draft completed. I'm seeing nods, so it seems that we're in agreement. But again, should there be any concern or objection, please feel free to contact me. That goes as well for folks who might not be here today and are watching the recording. All right, so our next meeting again will be on October 24th at 12 p.m. We will prepare to have that contact list and everything, and the letter associated with it completed on September 26th, just so you all have that in your brain, as well as a deadline, with the final draft completed, at or before our next meeting, for distribution on October 31st, which is also a Tuesday. So that is the timeline we're looking at based on today's discussion. And again, feel free to reach out to me for any further clarity or conversation. But I truly appreciate the prep work that you all did before coming to today's meeting, both in the last month, but also throughout this process. And I'm definitely eager to see our final product, as I do think it'll be helpful to institutions. While there is a lot of flexibility, and I know institutions are already working, toward having these assessments, prepared. I think that this will be a helpful tool for them to all turn to during that time. So thank you very much for your participation. And with that, I will open the floor for somebody to make a motion to close our meeting.
I'll move to adjourn.
A second.
Thank you all for your time, and we'll talk soon.